Obama, and have enjoyed that every time. I appreciate your wisdom and contributions in this field. I'm honored to share the podium and panel with Margot Kuchel. I admire Margot's research and her service as a medical doctor, and so it's an honor to be here. So I, as I mentioned, have been traveling around talking about this book a lot, and I have observed rooms such as this. And so I like to start my talks with a note of optimism and end with a note of optimism. What gives me optimism is when I walk into a room and see this. 1,000 people in this room who care deeply about the issue of homelessness. People in this room who are working every day to end homelessness or make it very brief. That gives me optimism. And there's a lot of negative news about homelessness, and I was in New York yesterday speaking at the ULI conference, and the head of the National Homelessness Law Center came up. I had not met her before, and she introduced herself, and I thanked her and her team for all the work they're doing on criminalization of homelessness, and she said, "I'm optimistic." And I said, "Why is that?" She said, "Because in the last 2 months we have had people from all over the country come together to talk about the problems associated with criminalizing homelessness, and that gives me optimism." So I'm bringing that optimism into the room today. I'm one voice among many who are talking about this, and I think this is a prime example of diverse and different perspectives coming together. I'm a weird voice on this. I'm a reformed investment banker who now studies homelessness. And a lot of people are like, why is this guy up here? So when people ask me, why do I study this, I give one of two responses depending on my mood. My first response is, I think it is an outrage in the wealthiest nation in the history of this planet that we allow homelessness to persist. The second answer I give is when I explain why I study housing, is that housing is fundamental to a healthy and productive life. And this is when I channel my friend Margot Kuchel. I watched Margot testify in front of the California legislature, and she sat down, and this is not a direct quote, but this is the gist of what Margot said. She said, "I'm a medical doctor and I care for people experiencing homelessness, and I am telling you the best thing you can do to help the health of my patients is ensure that they have housing."
That's right.
End of story. So there is a direct link. There is a direct link to the health and viability of our communities based on our ability to provide housing. Anyone who has lived in one of our major cities knows that we have a big problem housing people. I moved to Seattle in 2017, was quickly involved in conversations around housing and homelessness, and I would leave these meetings saying, I don't think we really understand what's going on. Competing narratives among policymakers and the media, and understandably, the citizens of our city are saying, what the heck is going on? Why is this problem so bad? And so I was motivated to write a book and help explain that. We've known this in the academic literature for some time, but the causation around homelessness is difficult because it's complicated. This is an incredibly complicated phenomenon. There's a lot of different ways of knowing about homelessness. One of the ways we know about homelessness is we ask people who are experiencing homelessness about their experiences. Lived experience is essential to this conversation. And when we ask people, they give us very blunt answers. My boyfriend beat me up and I ran. Now I'm homeless. I made some poor choices. I drink too much. I lost my job. I got in a fight with my roommate. Okay? And I'm coming in saying, well, we've got a housing market issue, and my colleague here is saying that this is a domestic violence issue. So the point of the book is not to say that one is right or one is wrong. The point is the intersection between personal circumstance and context. That is the point of the book. So the way that we do that in the book is to try to draw a distinction between precipitating events and root causes. Both are important. It's not a distinction to say one is right and one is wrong. They are both accurate, but they're different. The analogy we use to explain this is musical chairs. Imagine 10 friends come together to play a game of musical chairs. The leader starts music. They start walking around in a circle. The leader stops the music, or pulls a chair out, stops the music, and everyone scrambles for a chair, and by definition, someone loses. In this case, it was Mike, who was on crutches after spraining an ankle. And if we interviewed Mike and the other competitors about the game and said, why did Mike lose, what would people say? Had a bad ankle. And everyone would nod, yeah, Mike had a bad ankle, that's why he lost the game. We focused on Mike's vulnerability. If we ask a different question, though, and say, why didn't Mike have a chair? The answer to that question is we didn't have 10 chairs. I would argue that this is exactly what we're experiencing in many of our US cities right now. When housing is scarce, it's a vicious game of finding scarce units. And who loses in that game? People who are old or disabled or have been discriminated against or addicted or are poor. And we end up focusing on these risk factors rather than focusing on the structural explanation for why we have this problem, which is people are unable to access housing at sufficient levels. So the question we pose in the book is pretty simple. Why do rates of homelessness vary so widely throughout the United States? San Francisco and Seattle have 5 times the per capita homelessness of Chicago. We should want to understand why that is. And if we can answer that question with some level of credibility, it will also help us focus our time, attention, and resources on what's fundamentally driving this crisis. Many people will say, if you're poor, if you're mentally ill, or if you're addicted, you're more likely to experience homelessness. And that is absolutely true. So if we have more people with those conditions in the city, we'll have more homelessness. End of story. It turns out that's not true. It doesn't stop people from saying it, but it turns out it's not true. So the fundamental premise of this book is that tight housing markets accentuate vulnerabilities and produce homelessness at high levels. And these factors that get a lot of time and attention, which they deserve that time and attention, are really sorting mechanisms to identify the people who are most likely to lose housing when housing is scarce. So I don't want you to leave here and say, Greg doesn't think addiction and mental illness are a problem. They absolutely are. I think we have a moral and ethical obligation to treat that. But we also need to focus on the structure and the context in which people live, which helps us to understand some of these patterns around the United States. So I only have 12 minutes, so I'm going to go fast, so buckle your seatbelts, folks. I apologize. The point of this slide is we have big variation. We have places with lots of homelessness per capita and other places with far less. Let's try to explain that. The logic of the book is we'll take all the conventional explanations for homelessness. We use pretty basic statistics and tests. Does it help us understand why Seattle has 5 times the homelessness of Chicago? If it doesn't, we cross it off and move to the next one. That's the logic. Poverty. It's a good place to start because, of course, homelessness is a poverty problem. We all know that. What's interesting, though, is when you plot rates of poverty in the United States, what you'll see is that places with really high rates of poverty, like Cleveland and Detroit and St. Louis, have lower rates of homelessness than very affluent places like Seattle, San Francisco, and Boston. That's a head scratcher, because I just told you poverty causes homelessness. So what's the takeaway from this slide? My interpretation of this slide is not that poverty doesn't matter. Poverty is a scourge of society. The point of this slide is being poor in an affluent place has different consequences. And we would argue that's because of the housing market. Obviously, lots of attention is paid to drug use and mental illness in the conversations around homelessness. But when you plot rates of homelessness and drug use throughout the United States, what you'll see is it bears very little relationship to rates of homelessness. So the problems in California are not that California has disproportionate numbers of addicts or people who are experiencing mental illness. It's the consequences of those conditions in those states are different. This is when I start to get angry emails. Okay? I actually have an inbox or a folder in my email inbox for these emails. Okay? So when people challenge me on the drug use, I just saw Joel in the street and there was a needle next to him. I'll say, do you think people use drugs in Chicago? They do. Do you think people use drugs in West Virginia? They do, at very high rates, yet have not had the same experiences with homelessness that Seattle, San Francisco, and LA, and Boston, and New York, and DC have. So of course it's an issue, but we can't blame the problem on disproportionate drug use or mental illness in our coastal states and cities. So race, we can't talk about homelessness without talking about race. Of course, homelessness is a racial justice issue. But the point of this slide is race doesn't cause homelessness. The mere presence of people of color doesn't produce homelessness. If it did, Chicago would have a lot more homelessness than Seattle, which is a disproportionately white city. Black, brown, and indigenous people are 3 to 4 times overrepresented in the population of people experiencing homelessness. Okay? The reason for that is racism, not race. So race doesn't cause homelessness, racism causes homelessness.
Okay? Amen.
Discrimination in multiple sectors of society, criminal justice, education, healthcare, employment, all of that for generations have produced this disproportionality. Okay? That explains why black people are disproportionately present in the homeless population in Chicago, and they're also disproportionately present in the homeless population in Seattle. Okay? So none of these individual attributes do a very good job of explaining for us why we have this regional variation. We have to keep looking. Now we get into the category of explanations that I would call kind of cocktail party banter. Okay? The first one is the weather. Greg, the West Coast has a lot of homelessness because of the weather. Has anyone ever heard this one? Yes, maybe so. When you plot weather and homelessness, there's no relationship. There are warm places in Texas and Florida that don't have high rates of homelessness, and Boston is darn cold in January, and they have lots of homelessness. Okay? We can't blame Mother Nature. Have you heard this one? If we weren't so generous, all these people wouldn't move here to experience homelessness. Okay? Margot and her colleagues at UCSF just did an awesome study of homelessness in the state of California. And what did they find? Yeah, let's clap for that. And what did they find? They found that 90% of the people experiencing homelessness in the state of California are from California. This is a homegrown problem. We have to look in the mirror. Okay? Is there an anecdote to the contrary? Of course there is. We should not make policy based on anecdote. Okay? This is a homegrown problem. We need to look in the mirror and acknowledge the decisions that we've made that have created the environment that has allowed homelessness to flourish. Okay, as you might expect, we're going to get to the punchline here, and we make an argument that the housing market helps us understand this regional variation. This is rents and rates of homelessness, and what you'll see is a relationship, a statistical relationship that's far more powerful than anything else we test in the book. Where rents are high, homelessness is high. Not profound, we've known this for 20 years, but this doesn't make it into the conversation nearly as much as drug use or mental illness does. A related variable is vacancy rates. When vacancy rates are low, when housing is not accessible, homelessness is high. So fundamentally, if we want to attack and lower rates of homelessness in our coastal cities, what do we need to do? We need a heck of a lot more housing. And ideally, it would be housing that would be affordable for people with very low incomes. That's fundamentally what we need to do as a nation to address this. Okay? In the absence of additional housing, I fear that we're going to think 2024 was the glory days. And I don't think anyone in this room wants that to be the outcome. Okay, I'm going to wrap up here. So our data ended in 2019, so people will say, well, Greg, what's happened since? Well, a few things have happened. We had a pandemic, which complicated a lot of things. But generally speaking, the numbers we've seen post 2019 confirms the logic of the book. And that's good news and bad news. It's good news if you wrote the book, and so you can at least say, like, this holds. It's bad news because what we're seeing is the logic is moving into the interior of the country. Phoenix, Austin, Sacramento, Atlanta, Denver. What's happening? Tightening housing markets. Rents are going up, homelessness is going up. So unfortunately, this is moving in, and this is why I'm going all over the country to places like Iowa and Kentucky and Kansas and talking about homelessness, because every corner of the country is starting to feel this. This is a big month for homelessness. Later this month, the Supreme Court is going to hear a case about the criminalization. Okay? I encourage you all to use your power and your networks to talk about this. I'm encouraged and touched by the efforts of this broader community to write and to talk about the problems associated with this issue. Many states are also pursuing this. The state of Oklahoma recently had some legislators propose a criminalization bill. And I get Google alerts when my name or the name of the book appears. The author of this bill, Representative Weaver, was being interviewed by a journalist. And I don't know the journalist, but the journalist must have read our book. And the journalist asked this representative, do you think homelessness is a housing problem? And the response was, do I feel like it's a housing problem? It could be. I mean, if they don't have any place to live. Okay. So this is both a tragic and a kind of a comedic quote. But the people who are trying to criminalize homelessness will, when pushed, also acknowledge that this is fundamentally a housing problem. Okay, so final point. My hope with this book is that we as a society can stop focusing on individuals. It doesn't mean that individuals are an issue. The issue is that when we blame individuals for the outcome, it absolves us of collective responsibility. If I walk by Joe, If I walk by Joe on my way to the University of Washington in the morning, and I feel bad for Joe, but say Joe made some poor decisions, I can go about my day feeling pretty good. If I instead see Joe as the consequence of decisions that I, Greg Colburn, have contributed to, I need to look in the mirror at the end of the day and say, so what am I going to do? And what are we going to do? Okay? This is a structural problem. This is a structural problem. Structural racism, structural poverty, structural inequality, structural housing deficit. Structural problems require structural solutions. Structural solutions are hard. Why? They take resources, political courage. Mr. Olivet can talk about that. That's hard work. So finally, I'm going to end on a positive note. The final pushback I'll get is, Greg, you got your fancy slides. I don't think this is going to work. I don't think housing is going to help Joe. And I'll say, you know why I'm confident? It's because we've done it. The federal government has used the principles of Housing First to reduce veteran homelessness by 50% in 10 years. So the argument that this doesn't work is patently false, and you all are evidence of that. This works. What we lack is scale and political will. Thank you for your time and being here.